Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jennifer Leeds of the South Florida Water Management District. We see that we still have some participants calling in. We welcome everyone to our second public meeting for north of Lake Okeechobee Storage Reservoir, our Section 203 study. First, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Mr. Ben Butler, our governing board member who represents the area north of Lake. So Ben, turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you, Ms. Leeds. Sound check. We good?
We're good.
Yeah, we look good. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for taking the opportunity to join us for the project update for the Lake Okeechobee Component A Reservoir, or LOCAR. LOCAR is an above ground storage project that is being designed to store up to 200,000 acre feet of water north of Lake Okeechobee in eastern Highlands County. Since the year 2000, when served for the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was congressionally authorized, an above ground storage feature north of Lake Okeechobee was envisioned. We currently have above ground storage features in various stages of construction on the east, west, and south side of Lake Okeechobee, and LOCAR is the piece we've been missing. LOCAR, as envisioned in the Yellow Book, will serve as a key component to help improve the health of Lake Okeechobee by moderating its water levels and improve the health of the eastern and western coastal estuaries by reducing damaging discharges. In early May of this year, we had the initial kickoff and scoping meetings for LOCAR, and at that time, we shared the process, the timeline, and overall planning for an above-ground storage feature. Since that time, the team at the Water Management District has been working on evaluating alternatives, conducting analysis, and is now ready to share what they've been working on and looking at. Today, they'll go over the alternatives considered, the modeling, what the proposed plan is, and the benefits we are seeing through that analysis for the lakes and the estuaries. After the presentation, they'll open it up for questions from the public. We're not starting from scratch today. Many of you will remember that several years ago, we had scoping meetings for LORP, or the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project. At that time, several locations were considered for a reservoir feature in that effort, and the previous concerns from stakeholders and the tribes were taken into account, which is why we reevaluated one of the original sites from LORP study and are taking another look at them today. The district is still pursuing underground storage north of Lake under LORP with the Aquifer Storage and Recovery Well Program, but this will take time as the team is continuing to address the uncertainties with ASR wells by following the district science plan. LOCAR is not associated with LORP, and they are separate projects. In addition, the South Florida Water Management District is working with a company called EIP to develop a stormwater treatment area in Okeechobee County near the L62 Canal, which is also a separate project that is not associated with LOCAR. If you have any questions after the meeting today, you can reach out, and please reach out to our project manager, Liz Kaneha. She'll have her contact information available throughout the presentation here, or you can find her at sfwmd.gov. Go to the LOCAR page, LOCAR, and you can find it there through the search window. In closing, and on behalf of my other fellow governing board members, I have a few things. I want to thank our federal partners at the United States Army Corps of Engineers, Jacksonville District, for allowing the district to complete this Section 203 study and take the lead on LOCAR. I thank the staff at our Water Management District for their professionalism and expertise to pursue and complete this study. I thank our Governor DeSantis for this challenge, for his challenge and mandate in Executive Order 23-06 to achieve even more now for Florida's environment. And I thank you for your attendance. Your interest and participation in this process is critical to its success. My hope is that we can provide a clear explanation and that everyone will have an opportunity to participate in a meaningful way to ensure that this project is a success. And at this time, I will turn the presentation over to Liz Kaneha. the PM for LOCAR to give the project overview and announce the tentatively selected plan.
All right, thank you, Ben. As he said, my name is Liz Caneja, and I'm a project manager at the South Florida Water Management District and the Ecosystem Restoration and Capital Projects Division, and currently managing the LOCAR project. Following the presentation, as Ben had also mentioned, we're going to have our Q&A session and also be accepting public comment. At the end of the presentation, which is approximately 28 slides, we will have a slide that provides instructions on how to submit your questions and public comments. We do ask that you hold off on submitting questions until we're towards the end of the presentation, because some of the questions that you may have while we're going through our materials could be answered in the presentation. So moving on to what exactly a Section 203 feasibility study is. So the South Florida Water Management District is the non-federal sponsor for the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or SERP, and is conducting a feasibility study and environmental impact statement for the LOCAR project under Section 203 of the Federal Water Resources Development Act. The district is taking the lead on the feasibility study, including the coordination, the modeling, and report preparation, but the report has to be technical and policy compliant with the federal planning process. So we're working with our federal partner, the Army Corps of Engineers, to coordinate technical assistance and federal activities for this study. The district will transmit the feasibility study report to the Assistant Secretary of the Army for review, and then the ASA will submit it to Congress for authorization under Section 203 of WRDA. So once approved, this project will become part of the SERP program. This graphic here shows the LOCAR study area. The study area is positioned directly north of the lake in the center of the state and south of the Kissimmee-Orlando area. The study area is outlined in turquoise and encompasses the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie estuaries. Within the study area, there are 4 subwatersheds, which include Fish Eating Creek, Indian Prairie, and Taylor Creek Nub and Slough subwatersheds, and also drainage basins S65D and S65E of the Lower Kissimmee subwatershed. As you may recall, this study area looks very similar to LORP, but as Ben had said, this project is separate from LORP. LORP is looking at wetland restoration and underground storage with ASR wells, and LOCAR is focusing on just above ground storage north of the lake. The goal of the Lake Okeechobee Component A project is to provide approximately 200,000 acre-feet of storage north of Lake O. The purpose of LOCAR is to store water during wet periods or when there's excess water in the system, and later use this water during dry periods when Lake Okeechobee water levels are low. The increased storage capacity would help to keep the lake within the ecological preferred band and also benefit the lake's ecosystems. The project would benefit the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie estuaries to help reduce those discharges from the lake that impact their ecosystems. So in general, the project will keep water in the system for environmental and water supply uses. Here is the list of alternatives considered for LOCAR. All of them are targeting 200,000 acre-feet of storage, but the acreages do vary from 12,000 acres to 19,000 acres, and each reservoir footprint could hold anywhere from 10 to 19 feet of water. LOCAR Alternative 1 is referred to as the potential reservoir. It's that top left footprint that you see there. It's approximately 12,000 acres in size and would have a maximum water depth of 18 to 19 feet. LOCAR Alternative 2, which is referred to as a dual reservoir, that's the top right map that you see on this slide. The 2 reservoirs would be combined to function together, and they would be approximately 19,000 acres in size with a maximum water depth of 10.2 feet. LOCAR Alternative 3, which is referred to as a north-south reservoir, that's that bottom right map. The feature would be approximately 13,700 acres in size and would have an average water depth of 14 feet. Rough order magnitude cost estimates, or ROM costs, and modeling were performed for all 3 of these alternatives. All of the alternatives performed very similarly because they are comparable in storage benefits. However, the cost did vary across the board for these 3 footprints due to land acquisition, dam embankment, construction cost, and infrastructure cost. For LOCAR, the proposed tentatively selected plan, or TSP, is Alternative 1. It is approximately 12,000 acres in size and will have an average water storage depth of 19 feet, providing approximately 200,000 acre-feet of storage. The length of the perimeter dam that surrounds the footprint of the project is 18 miles, and the total length of the divider dam between the two cells is approximately 2.7 miles. So the design incorporates two cells for added safety to improve the flexibility for operations and maintenance, and they are connected by open culverts. So here I'll zoom into the map so you can see it a little bit better, but we're envisioning two inflow pump stations. One pump station would be located at S84, and the pump station would pull water from the lake up the C41A towards the next pump station, which is at the southeast corner, and they would pump water into the reservoir at approximately 1,500 CFS. There will be a gravity discharge back to the system to the C41A canal via two gated structures, which would be totaling approximately 3,000 CFS. The location of the two reservoir outflow culverts allows for the water to be released from the reservoir into the C41A canal upstream or downstream of the S83 structure and convey water into the Indian Prairie subbasin via the C41A, the C41, C39A, C40, and the C38 canal, as well as back to Lake Okeechobee. The perimeter canal, which would be around the footprint of the feature, would be able to collect stormwater and seepage from the reservoir and return the water back to the reservoir. So now I'll hand it over to John Mitnick, which will go over some of the reservoir dam safety features.
Thank you, Liz. As Liz said, my name is John Mitnick. I'm the Assistant Executive Director and Chief District Engineer here at the Water Management District. I'm going to briefly touch on some of the design features or considerations that we have to take into account when we design any large civil works project like this reservoir that's being proposed. So one of the first things that we have to take into consideration is dam safety. And this particular project, just like with any of the other projects that Mr. Butler referenced earlier on his talk on the reservoirs that are being built both to the east, west, and south of Lake Okeechobee, this project to the north will also have to consider and adhere to very strict dam safety requirements. As part of that design process and reviewing the different designs, there will be a team that's set up both internal to the Corps of Engineers that will review the designs and provide any comments on those designs to make sure that we're adhering to those strict dam safety standards. There'll also be a team within the Water Management District that reviews those designs separate and apart from the individuals who are actually doing the design. In addition to that, we'll also be bringing in an independent peer review panel of external experts to participate in the review of those designs, just to make sure that we're adhering to all of those dam safety criteria and standards. So some of the kind of things that we're looking at, and anybody who lives in South Florida should be able to appreciate this, any large scale body of water gets greatly affected by tropical systems, tropical storms or hurricanes. So this particular project, given its location and its footprint on the landscape, we're going to have to look at the intensity of those tropical systems, and it's part of our design criteria that we'll be designing it to. So one of the two things that we'll be looking at is the level of storm that this particular project will have to be designed to withstand. So it'll be designed to withstand a Category 5 hurricane and be able to contain or hold within the reservoir itself direct rainfall up to 54 inches. Now, I know when I say 54 inches, not a lot of people can wrap their minds about how much water that really is. So to put it in context, on average, all of South Florida receives about 52 inches of rain a year in a given average year. Now, anybody that lives in South Florida, you know that you can be out in your backyard enjoying a nice sunny day, but 5 blocks away, it's pouring down rain. So that 52 inches of average rainfall doesn't fall evenly everywhere, all over the landscape. So what I did is I went back and looked at, one second, can't get the slides to change. There we go. Went back and looked at the past 2 tropical systems that have impacted South Florida, one being Hurricane Irma back in 2017, and just last year, which I'm sure is still fresh in folks' mind, Hurricane Ian from 2022. Both storms made landfall on the lower West Coast and traversed up to the Northeast, right across where this project is being proposed. So to give an idea of what 54 inches of rain looks like in both of these storms in 2017, you can see Hurricane Irma had about 17 inches of rainfall there on the lower West Coast when it made landfall, but when it got up to this area up in lower Kissimmee where the project is proposed, it was just a little bit less than 12.5 inches of rain. Similar story for Hurricane Ian. As it passed over the area where the reservoir is being proposed, it was just about 12 inches of rain. And the maximum amount of rainfall during Hurricane Ian was up in the upper Kissimmee Basin around St. Cloud, just shy of 18 inches of rain. So that hopefully gives folks a feel of what 54 inches would be. It's significantly more water than what fell both in Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Ian in 2022. So what that equates to is the dam height. So we use that information of how much rainfall the dam needs to be able to hold is to determine how high the dam itself or how high the reservoir is itself. So as you heard Liz say, on average, the depth of water that this reservoir is proposed to store under the tentatively selected plan is about 19 feet. So in order to contain the 54 inches of rainfall plus the wind and waves that are generated from a Category 5 storm, roughly equates to having 14 feet of freeboard. And all freeboard is the height above the water surface till you get to the top of the dam. So it's the difference between where the water is and the top of the dam. So that those two criteria are driving the dam or the reservoir embankments to about 33 feet in height above ground. And to give you a feel for kind of what that looks like, anybody that has driven from South Bay over to Clewiston along State Road 80, if you look to your right, or it could be your left, depending on which way you're heading, you'll see the Herbert Hoover Dike. In that reach, as you drive from South Bay over to Clewiston, the Herbert Hoover Dike is about 30 to 40 feet tall. So that'll give you some perspective on what the dam would look like if you were viewing it from outside and how high those berms would be. So the next sort of design element or criteria that we have to take into consideration when we design large above ground impoundments is seepage control or seepage management. Anytime you build an embankment or a levee out of earthen material or dirt and sand, then water is going to want to seep through it. So it's not necessarily that we're looking to stop that seepage, but rather we're looking to control or manage that seepage. So this particular reservoir, just like all the other reservoirs that are currently being under construction or have been built in South Florida, it will incorporate several different seepage management or seepage control features. The main one being a cutoff wall. You can sort of see it here in yellow on this graphic on the screen. The idea behind the cutoff wall is to intercept a lot of that seepage that is traversing through the embankment itself and direct it down deeper into the aquifer. And that cutoff wall will extend several feet, if not tens of feet, down into the foundation and down into the aquifer to sort of direct that seepage deeper into the aquifer. In addition to that, another seepage management feature of the project will be right in this general area right here on the reservoir itself, or the toe of the embankment. There'll be some additional seepage control features to intercept any additional seepage that gets from direct rainfall on the dam itself, or gets around and through the cutoff wall and comes back up underneath the foundation of the dam, to be able to intercept again that seepage and control it and direct it to what is the last seepage management feature over here on the left-hand side of the graphic, which is the seepage canal itself. So the reservoir will have a seepage canal that surrounds it in its entirety to intercept and capture that seepage that may be coming through through the embankment or direct rainfall on the outside of the embankment, and then return that seepage back into the reservoir itself such that it is controlled, it is managed, and does not have any impact to any adjacent private property that may be in the vicinity of the reservoir itself. And lastly, one of the design elements that we're evaluating and taking into consideration is we're looking at to make conveyance capacity improvements to the C41A canal within the existing right-of-way for the canal. And that effort is to not only be able to handle and direct storm discharges to Lake Okeechobee during storm events, but also, as Liz alluded to be able to pull water back from Lake Okeechobee and pull it back up the C41A canal and put it into the reservoir for storage and use later during dry times when the water may be needed. So with that, that's just a quick overview of some of the design considerations that we've got to go through when we design these large above ground impoundments, adhering to strict dam safety standards with multiple levels of review, both internal and external experts participating in those reviews. And with that, I'll hand it off to Walter to talk a little bit more about some of the modeling work that has been done to date.
Thanks, John. And I don't have control of the presentation, so if someone could advance the slide, I'd appreciate it. So I'm Walter Wilcox. I lead the, if I can get to the slide. Thanks. So I lead the modeling section of the Hydrology and Hydraulics Bureau here at the South Florida Water Management District. So John and Liz took you through a lot of the local features associated with the proposed LOCAR reservoir and the specifics of how that's designed and manages the local, seepage and wave runup. We also employ regional hydrologic models to help us understand how the storage feature has the potential to benefit the overall South Florida system. So these models are hydrologic computer models. They're designed to handle the hydrologic cycle. They take rainfall and simulate evapotranspiration and water movement throughout the system. And you can kind of see in the graphic in the middle there, the spatial extent encompasses our entire South Florida system from the upper chain of lakes through our study area into Lake Okeechobee, out to the northern estuaries, and then eventually south into the Everglades. So these models have been developed over the last several decades. They've been independently scientifically peer-reviewed, and they're the same modeling tools that we use for other both comprehensive Everglades restoration planning studies and other planning studies that both the Army Corps and the South Florida Water Management District typically lead. So most recently, these models have been used in development of the newly proposed Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual schedule for Lake Okeechobee. It's actually the same models that were used for the development and evaluation of the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir and the other reservoirs around Lake Okeechobee. So when we run these models, we go through a process called calibration where we match the historical data, and then we move into a application phase where we're trying to predict what might happen in the future. And we run different scenarios with a historic climate record from 1965 through 2016. So when you see the upcoming slides that show the evaluation results, you can imagine we're trying to answer the question, what happened if it rained the same way that it rained in 1965 or 1995 or 2011? How would the future system with this LOCAR storage reservoir added to it, how would it behave, and what types of responses would we see, and how do those compare to what we see in today's system where we don't have that storage feature? So the models help to give us the ability to analyze those future what-if conditions. So if you move to the next slide, in order to look at that comparison, we use a concept known as baselines. So we have 2 points of comparison that are part of the evaluation that you'll see here today. We run an existing condition baseline, which represents the current system or something very close to what we would be experiencing in today's system or in the near term future. And so that current system is basically the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual operations for Lake Okeechobee. And so it again simulates that 1965 through 2016 period, and we see a range of conditions with wet periods, dry periods, everything in between. And we see how Lake Okeechobee and how discharges to the northern estuaries and discharges south would behave with the operating protocols of LOCIM in place. And then, as Mr. Butler described earlier, we know that there's a number of other projects that are happening in parallel with the Lake Okeechobee storage reservoir. And we want to account for this feature working well with those features as well. And so we look at a future, what we call without project condition, where we're looking approximately 50 years into the future, and we account for all of the other authorized projects that are being planned in the system, the EA Reservoir, the C43 Reservoir, reservoirs in the Indian River Lagoon and the St. Lucie, and to the south, the Central Everglades project. And so we use these two baselines as points of comparison. Neither of these particular runs have the LOCAR storage in them, but they give us points of reference that say what would today's system and what would the future system look like if we did not do this project. And then if you move to the next slide, we run a series of scenarios where we update the model to include the alternatives that Liz took you through a couple minutes ago. So you can see that we have 3 with project alternatives, the LCR1, LCR2, and LCR3 that represent alternatives 1, 2, and 3. Those modeled features include all of the storage features, the conveyance features that Liz took you through, the footprint of the reservoir, the water depths that John described, the additional pump stations that move water from Lake Okeechobee into the storage reservoir. And we connect that storage reservoir with the regional system. We put in some operations that help to send water to the reservoir when Lake Okeechobee is high and when we're having to make discharges to the northern estuaries. And then, as Liz described, we try to get that water back from the reservoir when Lake Okeechobee starts to recede and is getting low, and we need that water in the system for water supply for Lake Okeechobee health and for beneficial base flow to the estuaries. And so we put all of those things into the model. In this particular case, the reservoir can also discharge to the C41 and C41A canals in the lower Indian Prairie Basin. And that allows us to send some water from the reservoir during wetter times in order to help meet water supply needs in that basin, in particular for the Seminole tribe, Brighton Reservation. So all of those assumptions are put into the model, and we run these hydrologic scenarios for 50 years of climate record, and then we compare the baselines to the with project alternative to see what differences we expect if we put this feature into the system. And as Liz already mentioned, because the storage features are the same between, in terms of total size, between the LCR1, LCR2, and LCR3, they're all having roughly that 200,000 acre feet of storage that Mr. Butler described as the SERP goal. We see that the performance of the 3 with project alternatives is all very similar for the regional system. And so for ease of presentation today, we're going to focus on the tentatively selected plan, the LCR1 scenario. So you'll see 3 runs in the upcoming set of graphics. Basically the current condition, the future if we didn't do the project, and then the future with the project, which is the LCR1 scenario. So with that background, I'm going to pass it over to Therese East, who's going to start taking you through the evaluation of the system for Lake Okeechobee. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Therese East. I'm a section leader here at the South Florida Water Management District. I work on lakes and the Lakes and Rivers section, and I'm a scientist who's been working on Lake Okeechobee. So in Lake Okeechobee, it's really all about the water levels. This graphic shows how the different lake stages can affect the nearshore and marsh plant communities. Under ideal conditions, the Lake Okeechobee shoreline marsh is approximately 100,000 acres with a diverse plant community arranged by their tolerances for specific water depths. In this graphic, the submerged aquatic vegetation, which is depicted as SAV, is in a zone between the deeper open water and the shallower marsh area. It occurs around 8.5 to 11.5 feet in elevation. Then the sparse vegetation like grasses and bulrush grow from about 10 to 11 feet in elevation. And then there's a broad, diverse marsh at about 12 to 15 foot elevation. And this marsh is seasonally flooded at different water depths for different durations. And this allows or provides a wide variety of habitat for fish and other wildlife. So maintaining the stage within this, within an ecological envelope, which is between roughly 12 and 15 feet during the year, is able to maintain this diverse habitat. And that's the area depicted in the green in the graphic. So when lake stages are too high for too long, the presence of the shallow marsh community is decreased. And when the stages are too low for too long, the shallow marsh dries out and they convert into more of the upland or woody species. And this allows the marsh plants to take over areas that were previously either submerged aquatic vegetation or even encroach into the open water. So maintaining this optimal habitat and the envelope is what we are focusing on. And the performance metrics for Lake Okeechobee focuses on how long the stages are within this ecological envelope. So that's a little bit of background. Next slide, please. So looking at this ecological envelope, it's not static 12.5 to 15 or 12 to 15 the entire year. There's a seasonal component to it. It varies by season, so that at the start of the dry season, say in January on this graphic, you see that it's at the higher lake stages. And as the year progresses throughout February, March, April, there's a decrease in a slow decrease in lake stage, that to a low of about 12 feet at the beginning of the wet season. And then as the wet season progresses again, you get an increase in lake stage to the higher lake levels. So this is the way we would like to see the lake managed for the best and optimal performance. So one of the performance measures tallies penalties for how far the lake stage is from this envelope, either above or below for the period of record. And the farther away from the envelope, the higher the penalty. So let's say, for instance, on January 1st of any year, which would be the left side of the this graphic with the envelope, lake stage is about 16 feet. So we see that 16 feet is above the envelope. So it would that day would get an upper penalty score. Say the lake stage was about 13 feet. So that's down in the yellow, and that's below the ecological envelope. So that would get a lower penalty score. If lake stage was 15, it's right in the envelope in that gray area. And so there would be no penalty points. So what we do is we count, add up all of the penalty points through this period of record to see how differently these models run. So for instance, if you look at the graphic on the right, the bar chart, we see that about 43,000, if we total up the penalty scores for the existing condition and baseline, we see that about 43,000 penalty points are accumulated, with about 29,000 of those are in the upper penalty and about 14,000 of those are in the lower penalty. So we see that there's a lot of instances where lake stage is a lot higher than the envelope. The middle bar represents the future without, and the total penalty scores decreased from over 43,000 to down to 37,000. And the upper penalty scores also decreased. The lower penalty scores, however, increased from 14,000 to 17,000. Looking at the last bar on that chart, we see that's the alternative. That's the tentatively selected plan. Had a decrease in the total number of penalty scores. And not only that, there was a decrease in both the upper penalty scores and the lower penalty scores, which is what we would like to see. So while this means that the stages are getting closer to the envelope on both the high and the low end because we've added storage area to the watershed. Next slide, please. Another way to look at this a little more in detail is what we call a stage duration curve. This represents the amount of time that the stage is within a certain or a given stage. So the dotted line here represents the existing baseline condition. And we see that for the ECB, that 10% of the time, the lake stage was higher than about 16.5 feet. That's the red circle on the left. You see at 16.5 feet, the amount of time above that is 10%. Looking at the circle on the right, we see that similarly, the high stage higher than about 13.5 feet occurred approximately 60% of the time. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at the future without and see how it is different than the baseline, which the future without is the red line here. And we see that there is about that at 15.5 feet, for example, the ECB or the existing condition, the dotted line has a stage above 15.5 feet about 26% of the time versus about 15% of the time for the future without. Or there's an about 11% reduction in the time that the lake stage spends above 15.5. On the low end, you can see that the future without spends about 2% more time at the lower stage at less than 9.5 feet, for example. So you see we're kind of trading off reducing high stage by increasing the duration of time at the low stage a little bit. Next slide, please. Looking at how the tentatively selected plan model run looks. So just as in the previous slides, we see there's a reduced time at the higher stages, but there's also a reduced time at the lower stages. You see here that, remember that the ECB was about 10% of the time you were above 16.5 feet, but with the TSP, that's reduced to about 2% of the time, the blue line here. And on the low end, you can see that in most cases, the duration at the low stage is similar to or even a little better than the ECB on the dotted line. So adding storage to the watershed helps us to kind of flatten this curve or to spend more time at average water levels between this 12.5 to 15.5 ecological envelope. It reduces the frequency of high and low lake stage events. And remember, this is without the ASRs, which would be another Lake Okeechobee watershed project. So these results are just with the reservoir, and including the ASRs could potentially give us even more benefit. So that's all I have for Lake Okeechobee. I think I'm going to hand off to Phyllis Klarman to present the coastal system results.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Phyllis Klarman. I am a senior scientist in the Applied Sciences Bureau in the coastal ecosystem section. And so I'm here to represent the estuaries, and we'll share with you what LOCAR, the tentatively selected plan, will do to benefit inflows to the estuaries. So before I get into the model results, I wanted to provide a refresher and an overview of the performance measure metrics that we were using to compare the alternatives. So RECOVER, the Restoration Coordination Verification Program, which is the science arm of the SERP, updated a salinity envelope performance measure in 2020 that defines optimal inflows in cubic feet per second for both the St. Lucie estuary and the Caloosahatchee estuaries that will provide suitable salinities as the main driver from inflows to the hydrologic change from projects that will benefit certain ecological indicator species, which I'll go through very briefly on this slide. So let me orient you to what we're looking at here. In the center map, what we have here is a map of the St. Lucie estuary, and the colors that you see on that map are indicative of salinity. So the salinity key is over in the top right-hand corner, and this is modeled average salinity given a specific flow regime or flow range. And so in this case, you can see listed on the map on the top right, these are modeled average salinities when we see a biweekly moving average flow of 150 to 1400 cubic feet per second, or CFS. And in the Recover performance measure, this is what is categorized as optimal flow. And the reason why that we determine that this is optimal is it provides a beneficial salinity throughout the entire system to support those indicators. It's said that estuaries are where rivers meet the sea. And so what we see with estuaries usually is upstream near the freshwater source. We have fresh to low salinities. You could see here on the map that being the case in the yellows, those are low salinities ranging from 0 to 2, 3 to 4, and 5 to 9. And then as you move closer to the ocean connection downstream, you will see that those salinities slowly increase and provide this gradient of salinity, again, from that freshwater upstream source down to, in this case, the St. Lucie Inlet, where we have a connection to the Atlantic Ocean. And with this gradient, it supports different communities of organisms. And so this flow regime will provide that nice salinity gradient throughout the whole system. In this case, it's broken up here into several zones. So upstream in the St. Lucie River, we have an oligohaline zone. This just means low salinity. And this zone will, when in proper salinity ranges, will provide really good habitat for some larval fish species, including the much sought after red drum, for example. There is a paper that came out, I think last year, through Florida Fish and Wildlife that showed that the river is used as a hotspot for larval red drum, among other fish species such as snook, during the wet season. And so we want to maintain that oligohaline or low salinity zone for those organisms. Move downstream, there's a mesohaline zone, and this is salinities a little bit higher. So in the map on the right, the key, you could see that salinities range from 10 to 14 and 15 to 9 here. And this salinity supports larval and adult oysters. This range of salinity will also minimize disease. When we get higher salinities, oysters tend to have a higher prevalence of a protozoan parasite. And the flows will also be sufficient to allow for larval settling. And so if the flows are too high when the oysters are spawning, the oysters could, the larvae, which are free in the water, could be flushed out of the system, for example. And then moving further downstream with the polyhaline zone, this is again with slightly higher salinities. You can see here we're ranging 20 to 24, 25 to 29, and 30 to 35, ocean salinities being at 35. And this zone is going to be really good for the marine submerged aquatic vegetation or seagrasses specifically, but it's also good for larval and adult oysters. Again, it minimizes the disease upstream with this particular flow regime, and the flows are sufficient to allow that, again, the oyster larvae to settle out. And if you can move to the next slide, please. So there's going to be a lot I'm covering on this slide, so I'll slowly walk you through it since there's a lot of different metrics. On the previous slide, I showed what Recover defines as the optimal flow category, but this assemblage of maps on the left include additional flow categories defined in the performance measure, which I'll walk through you here. In the top right, you're seeing in this map modeled salinity with what Recover defines as low flows. So these are biweekly moving average flows from 28 to 150 CFS. The top right, you're going to see, again, that same map that you saw in the previous slide. So that's the optimal flow regime and the modeled salinity from that range, biweekly 150 to 1400 CFS. Moving to the second row on the left, we have what is defined as stress flows or high flows. This is based on a biweekly moving average flow of 1400 to 1700 CFS. And you could see that that low salinity range in the yellows is slowly starting to make its way further downstream as those flows increase. Next, we see what's defined as damaging flows in the performance measure. So this is a very conservative range to protect the uppermost range of oyster reef in the middle estuary. You could see that this map is with the average flows over biweekly 1700 to 2000 CFS. And again, that low salinity zone is continuing to move its way downstream further. And then we also modeled some additional flow bins in that damaging range, since the performance measure for Recover only says that damaging flows is exceeding 2100 CFS. I'm sorry, over 1700 CFS. We wanted to show what those potential downstream impacts could be in these higher flow categories. So that's what the bottom row is showing here. So there's 3 different maps showing salinities with 2000 to 3000 CFS, 3000 to 4000 CFS, and then greater than 4000 CFS. So just pointing out that bottom right map for you real quick, you'll see that the majority of the estuary is either in a fresh condition or less than 10, which is going to be potentially damaging to oysters and to seagrasses if that salinity is past a certain time period, which is where the biweekly part of this mechanism comes in. So what I have here on the right that popped up when I walked through each of these flow categories are the model results from that period of simulation that Walter had described earlier with the existing condition baseline, or ECB, compared to the tentatively selected plan for LOCAR LCR1. And I break these down by each of those flow categories, and the colors match up so you can kind of see each metric, what that looks like in terms of salinity. So starting with the low flow events up top in green, with the existing condition, we saw 183 of these low flow events, 28 to 150 CFS. With LOCAR, we see that there were 209 of these events over that 50-year period of simulation, which is 26% more. I think this comes out to about 14% overall increase in these low flows with LOCAR compared to the existing condition. And this could result in some higher salinities in the middle estuary, which is not super problematic for oysters and seagrasses, but in that oligohaline zone in the river, that's really important for those larval fish species. We may see some increases in salinity there. Moving on to optimal flow events. In this case, more is better. And you could see with the existing condition, there were 910. With a LOCAR tentatively selected plan, we have 1,013, which comes out to 103 more, which is an 11% increase with LOCAR. And this is great because this is the condition that will provide that overall estuarine gradient to support the variety and diversity of the ecological community that I had highlighted on the previous slide. Moving on to this white box. So here I specifically wanted to highlight the stress and damaging flows that result from lake releases as opposed to basin runoff. And so usually the performance measure is based on total inflow. So total inflow for the St. Lucie includes measured flow at S49, S48, S80, and then the Gordy Road structure. And in particular here, what I wanted to demonstrate was the benefit from LOCAR just to the lake releases, irrespective of the basin runoff. So that's what's in this white box. So in purple, we have these are stress events that are triggered by lake releases. Again, fewer of these events are better. And we see that there's 10 fewer events over that period of simulation, or a 33% decrease. And this is going to reduce the impact of low salinity to oysters in the North and South Forks driven by those lake releases. Moving on to damaging in that light blue, this is anything exceeding 1700 CFS biweekly, again, triggered by lake releases. And we could see that there's 12 fewer overall in the period of simulation, a 30% decrease, which will then protect the low salinity impacts to oysters in the middle estuary. And then finally on the bottom screen there, those higher flow bins, which would demonstrate further downstream impacts in these slowly increasing flows. We have overall across the board decreases in these damaging events. And specifically, this will include both basin runoff and lake releases. But what we're going to see is fewer of these impacts, such as that bottom right map, which would illustrate the entire system being fresh. So we would see that happening less often with LOCAR. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to move to the Caloosahatchee Estuary. Everything on the next, this slide and the next one is oriented in the same way. So again, here in the middle of the map, we have modeled average salinity in the Caloosahatchee Estuary that is based on the recover optimal flow category of biweekly moving average flows 750 to 2100 CFS. Again, you could see the modeled salinity ranges over there on the right. And as before, we want to see this estuarine gradient that includes an oligohaline zone, a moderate or mesohaline zone, and as we move our way closer to the Gulf of Mexico and San Carlos Bay, a polyhaline zone with these higher salinities. And in this case, I've included some of the ecological indicators that are being monitored as part of Recover's effort to assess SERP and other projects. So in the oligohaline zone here, we're specifically targeting a low salinity regime for tape grass, a submerged aquatic vegetation species that, unlike seagrasses, requires a low salinity or freshwater environment. And this zone will also support clams, clams being a component of the Caloosahatchee River Estuary MFL strategy, which is separate from this project, but worth noting. In the mesohaline zone there, again, we have oyster reefs. The uppermost extent of oysters in the Caloosahatchee Estuary is just past the Cape Coral Bridge. And so this flow regime would provide suitable salinities in that uppermost extent where those oysters are located. And then as we work our way downstream towards San Carlos Bay, this flow regime would also provide those suitable salinities for marine adapted seagrasses, and it's still suitable for oysters. I did mention that earlier that with increasing salinities, oysters can sometimes exhibit higher prevalence or intensity of disease. And so sometimes you'll see that in San Carlos Bay. The disease tends to be a little bit higher there for oysters, but not so problematic that it would kill them off. And of course, the salinities are going to be optimal there for seagrasses such as turtle grass, manatee grass, and others. So moving to the next slide, please. So similarly, this is the varying flow metrics as defined in the Recover PM, and I'll also walk us through each of these here. So in the top left, we have what's defined as low flows in the Caloosahatchee Estuary. And this is on this map showing average salinities modeled biweekly flows 457 to 750 CFS. And you can see with that flow regime that there is a disappearance of that yellow color upstream, which is that low freshwater or low salinity zone that's required for tape grass, which is indicative of salinity intrusion further upstream. And so the Caloosahatchee requires these supplemental flows into the system, especially during the dry season, to maintain that low salinity range for tape grass. And when we have those flows less than 750 CFS, you're going to see that increase in salinity in that zone. In the top right, we have the optimal flows, which we just showed on the previous map, previous slide, I mean. Biweekly moving average flows 750 to 2100 CFS, which provide that nice estuarine gradient. In the bottom left, middle left is the biweekly moving average flows 2100 to 2600 CFS. This is defined as stressful flows because we start to see a creep of the lower salinity down into the Cape Coral area. And this would indicate potential stressful conditions for that uppermost area of oyster reef. They like salinities greater than 10 typically. That middle right map is showing the damaging flows, and this is again conservative to protect the middle and lower estuaries. This is biweekly flow 2600 to 3500 CFS. You could see again, as those flows are increasing, you have a decrease in salinity further downstream. And then again, as part of an effort to show the downstream impacts of some extremely high flow. On the bottom row, we have biweekly flows ranging 35 to 4,500 CFS, 4,500 to 6,500 CFS, and greater than 6,500 CFS. And once again, just pointing out that lower right map with biweekly flow greater than 6,500 CFS, you could see that the salinities throughout the entire estuary are less than 5, which is of course going to be detrimental towards our oysters and marine SAV. And you even have some of that low salinity creeping down into the San Carlos Bay where the marine adapted seagrasses are. So despite the happy tape grass upstream, we will see those impacts further downstream for the marine organisms. And once again, just working through the model results for each of these metrics, starting at the top in green with low flows, we actually broke this up into flows that were less than 457 CFS and flows that were 450 to 750 CFS. And so you could see that with the less than 457 CFS, that we actually saw a 77% decrease or 329 fewer events over the period of simulation for this extreme low flow condition, which is huge for that tape grass, that oligohaline zone further upstream. We do see, however, an increase in the flows that range 450 to 750 CFS. We see 274 more, which is a 114% increase. But overall, that the improvement of that extreme low evens out generally, and overall we're seeing with LOCAR a less incidence of these low flow events that would affect that tape grass habitat upstream. Moving to the yellow category, this is optimal flow events. We see 50 more occurrences over the period of simulation compared to the existing condition with LOCAR. This is an 8% increase, and this is good because that will provide that nice estuarine gradient from upstream to downstream. And like I did on the previous slide, I wanted to include some specific benefits from lake-triggered stressful and damaging events to the Caloosahatchee. And so in this case, we see that there's 35 fewer events with of these stressful events in the range of 21 to 2,600 CFS that's triggered by lake releases specifically. And so this is going to, again, reduce the low salinity impact to that upstream extent of oysters around the Cape Coral Bridge. And with lake-triggered releases of greater than 2,600 CFS, we see 31 fewer, which is a 30% decrease with LOCAR. Finally, at the bottom here, I have those increasing damaging salinity ranges. And as you can see here, there is overall with LOCAR going to be reductions in the number of times that we see these extreme events. And in this case, this is going to be from both basin runoff and from lake releases. And the less often we see those high flow conditions, the better for that estuarine ecological community. And so overall, we're seeing, as stated with the St. Lucie, benefits from the additional storage, which is going to capture water and preventing us from having to send it east and west to tide. And that's all I have. So I believe now I'm going to pass it back over to Walter.
So before I quickly go through the water supply performance, I just want to mention that you're not going to see a slide, and you haven't seen a slide about flow south. The reason for that is that as part of the LOCAR alternatives, we are actively maintaining the flow south that was envisioned as part of the EA Reservoir project. So if you're familiar with the numbers, the LOSUM study sends a little over 200,000 acre feet on an average annual basis south as part of the current condition. With the future without condition and with all the LOCAR scenarios, we're sending over 500,000 acre feet south. So there's a significant lift in water going south to the Everglades. But the Everglades are not part of the LOCAR study area, and we're not changing the flows south as part of LOCAR. We're just doing the same types of deliveries in a manner where we're not drawing the lake down as in the way that Therese showed a couple slides earlier. So I just wanted to mention that. It was in the assumption slide, but just wanted to point that out as well. And so just to complete the picture, from a water supply perspective, there's a water shortage management policy that implements cutbacks on users in the Lake Okeechobee service area when lake stages fall too low during periods in the dry season in particular. And so the model keeps track of the time that the water spends in that water shortage management zone and the associated cutback volumes and cutback percentages that are imposed on users as part of that water shortage management policy. And what you're seeing in this graph is a number of the most severe drought years that are included in our period of simulation. You'll notice some of them from recent memory, 2007, 2008, 2011. So these water shortage periods are compared, and you can see that the existing condition has the highest bars, the blue bars, that represent the total cutback and highest percentage cutbacks associated with the lake operation. And when we add in the EA reservoir, which provides a local source of water, and the red bar, and then ultimately the LOCAR storage in the green bar, the LOCAR storage is improving low lake stages, and therefore there's less need to impose cutbacks on users of Lake Okeechobee service area water. So those same graphs that Therese showed a couple slides back with improvements in low lake stage are having the added benefit of reducing cutbacks to users within the Lake Okeechobee service area and ultimately the Lower East Coast water supply service area as well. So if you go to the next slide, I also just wanted to mention that we do see in the model that the local delivery of water to the Lower Indian Prairie Basin it also shows some potential. And so in this graph, these are average annual deliveries to the Seminole Tribe of Florida Brighton Reservation. And you can see in the model in the two bars on the left that the majority of the supplemental water being delivered to the reservation is in the green bar from Lake Okeechobee. And in the far right bar, you'll see that there's some potential for the yellow addition, which provides a supplemental source of water from the reservoir to this part of the system. So there's an ability to not just improve conditions in the lake, but also to provide some local water supply, in particular for the Brighton Reservation. That's all I had, so I'm going to pass it back to Liz. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Walter. All right. So this is the LOCAR project timeline. So as you can see, this is a very fast-paced planning project that was just initiated back in February. So we've already had our NEPA scoping meeting, which was held back in April. Our team internally identified the proposed TSP in July based on the modeling results and ROM cost. And we are here today on August 3rd announcing the TSP to the public. There will be a draft environmental impact statement or EIS released for public review in October with the final EIS in December, January timeframe. So we're hoping to complete the planning effort by February of 2024. So the final EIS will be submitted to the Assistant Secretary of the Army by February, and hopefully we'll make a congressional authorization for approval in WRDA 24. So here's information pertaining to our webpage. So if you can go to this link here and you'll see updates and information about upcoming engagements and future meetings. We'll also have the presentation from today's meeting posted on the webpage, maybe later today or possibly by tomorrow. And since this meeting is being recorded, it will also be available on the district's YouTube channel. So at this time, we'd like to open up the meeting for any questions you may have. If you have a question and you're using the Zoom feature, you can actually type it in the Q&A box and we will verbally read off your comment and provide a response. If you are calling into the meeting, you will have to use the raise hand feature and we can call your name. And once we call your name, you can select *9 to actually use the raise hand feature. And then you can use *6 to unmute yourself. So Jennifer Leeds is the Bureau Chief of the Ecosystem Restoration Planning Bureau, and she's going to be coordinating the Q&A session. And then I'll jump back in to assist with the raise hand feature. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz. So, so far I'm seeing two questions in the Q&A. So the first one is from Taylor. And the question is, what is the schedule for acquisition and construction of the Lake Okeechobee watershed project? So Taylor, I think you're referring to the CERT project, the Lake O Watershed Restoration Project. But whether you're referring to that one or whether you're referring to this one, LOCAR, our approach is the same. We usually wait for congressional authorization of these federal projects before we look to start the acquisition and construction of those projects. So first we would wait for congressional authorization. With LOCAR, we're looking for a WRDA 2024, and with the Lake-O Watershed Project, it is also looking for a WRDA 2024. So that would probably be the end of that calendar year and may go into after that. Okay, the next one from Mike. Looking at study area Indian Prairie, Lake Istapoga, leaves F68 to the Indian Prairie. Can we have a water regulation schedule study for Lake Istapoga accomplished with this project? The water leaving Lake Istapoga directly impacts the water flowing into the Indian Prairie area. The last study that was done has a date of 2012 and is out of date, as the lake says department, but I think it meant depth. I think it's missing an H, has changed. There are also now 2 gates locks in place at the S68 and the S68A, which was not the case before. So Mike, I'll take a first stab at this one, and if anyone else who is on our panel would like to jump in, please feel free to do so. Understand we've had this request before. So far for this one right now, the LOCAR project can take in basin flows, which could include flows coming from Lake Istapoga if the reservoir has room for it and capacity, and when the operation schedule is written, if it can take it in there. So we'll look at that as we're writing the operation schedule for that. There will be a draft operating plan in the draft report. And so as far as the study is concerned, we can take that back and then get back with you on that, as if there's any future plans to look at Lake Istapoga. I will say that in WRDA 2022, there was an authorization for a much larger comprehensive study of the C and SF system. So it may get incorporated into that. I would say stay tuned for more on that side. Let's see, who else do we have? Sam Erickson. Will there be a vegetation component and or treatment component to this project? Good question. So for this particular project, this is component A in the yellow book. It has a storage component and a treatment component to it. We're focused on storage. We have the opportunity to move the storage component forward. So we wanted to take that opportunity and have a very strategic and streamlined project that we knew that we could plan in a very quick manner and get it quick to a WRDA 2024. So as far as a vegetation component, it will be a deep storage reservoir. So typically those do not sustain vegetation. It's strictly a storage component. Richard Grondin, are there any possible adverse conditions for immediate adjacent properties, such as increased possibility of flooding, etc.? I can turn this one over to our district engineer, John Mitnick, if he would like to respond to this one.
Thanks, Jennifer. Let me pull the question back up. Right, adverse conditions, immediate property. So the way, as I walk through how we're going to manage and control the seepage that comes out of the reservoir, that will all be designed in a manner such that it does not affect any adjacent landowners. So it's actually a very strict requirement that we have to adhere to as part of any CERT project, that the implementation of the project cannot change the level of flood control for not only the adjacent property owners, but anybody within the basin that the project is being implemented in itself. So in other words, when we construct the reservoir within the Indian Prairie Basin, we've got to ensure that it does not adversely affect the flood control and flood risk for any property within the Indian Prairie Basin. Back to you, Jennifer.
Thanks, John. The next one I see is from Paul Gray. And Paul is just reminding everyone that a Lake Istapoga regulation schedule study was a part of the original LOP restudy. We tried to formulate, he said that the group tried to formulate one in 2000 to 2005 effort, but it was not completed. So thank you, Paul, for that reminder. And right now I don't see, oh, here we got another one. Mark Perry. Let's see. On the recover slide metrics for the St. Lucie estuary, you showed how the flows to the estuary where LOCAR benefits directly or reduces LACO-driven salinity impacts. Can you explain how this works with lake releases? So Phyllis, I would turn this one over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for your question. I'm just rereading it, so I think I understand what you're getting at. So showed how flows to the estuary where LOCAR benefits directly or reduces the LACO-driven salinity impacts. Can you explain how this works with the lake releases? So I think what you're asking is about, might be how the recover performance measure differentiates, I suppose, the lake versus the basin runoff, perhaps. So let me just give a first stab at just describing what the model, the RSM model, is doing there. And then maybe if Walter has additional insight, or if I didn't understand your question, Mark, you can repeat or add an additional comment here. So basically, what we're able to do with the stress and the damaging flow categories for the performance measure is the RSM model can differentiate whether it's basin runoff or it's lake releases that are triggering that stress or high or the damaging flow category. So this doesn't mean that it's just basin runoff or just lake releases. It's simply which one of the two is triggering that stressful or damaging event. And so what that can allow us to do in this case is look at specifically benefits from storage as it relates to and connects to Lake Okeechobee and ability to capture water in a reservoir. So I'll just, I guess, pause there. I don't know if anyone from the project team has any additional insight. I see Mark, you just added, how can a LOCAR directly benefit flows to the estuary unless it is through lake releases? Oh, I mean, that's exactly how it is. So it's just the recover PM also for the optimal, the low flows, and then those higher bins of the damaging flows is looking at total inflow. You are correct in saying that LOCAR benefits flows to the estuaries because it's through lake releases. And so we wanted to specifically point out how the flow metrics fall out from lake releases as opposed to including those the benefits that could come out when we look at total flows. It's just pulling out the specific numbers so that you can see the direct impact, because LOCAR is not looking and cannot affect basin runoff into the estuary. I hope that clarifies it.
Thank you, Liz. Okay, so I see one here from Mayor Watford that says, how about flood potential for Brighton Reservation in the event of dam failure? So I'm gonna throw this back to John Mitnick.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, I mean, obviously it goes without saying, we don't design things to fail. And that's why we spend a lot of time in the design process adhering to those strict national dam safety standards and having the external peer review, bringing in experts from around the country to review the design itself. However, in the very unlikely event of a failure, that is something we still take into consideration. So the very last slide that I had in my portion of the presentation talked about conveyance capacity improvements to the C41 canal to be able to direct storm discharges down to Lake Okeechobee. So that's part of it. We'll be evaluating improving the conveyance in the C41 canal in the unlikely event of a failure, such that the canal can absorb that water and direct it safely to Lake Okeechobee in and around that S84 structure and down the Kissimmee River into the lake. Beyond that, I'll tell you that we're still in the process of doing some modeling and continuing forth with the design, and we'll be evaluating other potential options to be able to mitigate any potential dam failure in the unlikely event should it occur.
Thank you, John. So Mark Perry had a follow-up question. Will this be different under LOSUM or LORS 2008? I think maybe I'll throw this over to Walter.
If I can get off unmute. Sorry about that. Yes, so the math would be different if depending on the starting point for those baseline comparisons. To refresh people's memory, in LORS 08, there was a pretty frequent operation that sent water east to the St. Lucie estuary, and those releases continued for down into what we call the base flow zone of Lake Okeechobee. So it was all the way down to about 12.6 feet in the lake. So if you were putting the LOCAR project on top of LORS 08, there would actually be a lot more potential for LOCAR to improve the, intercept those discharges that otherwise would go to the St. Lucie estuary and put them in the reservoir. The evaluation we showed here today is based on LOSUM because we firmly believe that LOSUM is the path forward. We just came out of a multi-year public process to try to create the improvements that are included in LOSUM. And for the St. Lucie estuary, LOSUM actually significantly reduces the discharges to the east, and the releases are only made when you're in the top two zones of the schedule. So the zone A, the zone B, C lines. And so the vast majority of the time when the lake is at 13 or 14 feet, there are no discharges being made to the St. Lucie estuary. So you'll notice in the graphs that Phyllis showed, the starting point numbers for the existing condition are relatively small in terms of those lake trigger counts. There's only 30 events or 20 events, I believe, for those high discharge counts. And LOCAR is continuing to improve them. But to answer your question, it would be different if we were looking at a LORS 08 type condition. And the decision we've made in this project is to try to focus on the LOSUM condition because we don't want to give up those benefits that LOSUM, was able to obtain for the St. Lucie estuary and other parts of the system.
Thank you, Walter. See, we have another question from Sam Erickson. Will the district's water quality monitoring program be expanded to include the inflows and outflows of the LOCAR project when it is completed? So Sam, I'd like to make one small distinction. So we do have a very robust water quality monitoring program, but like all of our projects that we do, we will also be subject to the regulatory requirements by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection when we get permits to both construct and operate this. And those will have a water quality component with it. And they will determine in there the specific permit conditions that will have to be met. Okay, Scott Martin says, will the study include the potential SAV increase in Lake Okeechobee during this LOCAR process? We believe 100,000 acres is our target and would like to see this part of the planning process at every level. So Therese, I don't know if you can maybe shine a little light on this one.
I'm not sure I can, but I'll try. Yeah. Well, we still have all of our SAV grid and transect monitoring in place. Basically, we do have performance metrics for both. And, we will still be monitoring that throughout both. Well, we've been doing it. We've been doing this monitoring for many, many years. We don't have specific tools to predict SAV and how it would change, or we don't have specific tools that will predict how the woody vegetation or the emergent vegetation will change, but we are still tracking and monitoring it. And we're working on predictive tools, predictive models for the SAV, but we don't have one developed right now. But having said that, we still like to have our performance metrics meet for SAV, greater than 35,000 acres of SAV on the lake, and specific amounts of that 100,000 acres of marsh, how much is woody versus herbaceous versus the grasses and those kinds of things. So we are still monitoring that kind of stuff. I don't know if that helped, but we do that on the lake regardless of this process, the LOCAR process.
Thank you, Therese. All right, we have one from Mike Goucher. It says, what is the taper grade from the 19-foot average depth to the dike itself? John, I don't know if you can take a stab at that one.
Yeah. So Mike, in one of my slides, once the whole presentation is posted on the website, I think it's slide 11, you'll see a cartoon cross-section of the dam itself going over to the seepage canal. That slope going up the inside of the embankment as well as the external embankment is about a 3-on-1 slope. So that's the grade going up from the water to the top. The inside face of the embankment will be covered with soil cement. And it'll, like I said, be on a 3-on-1 slope. Also, while I still got the mic, I wanted to add a little bit more to the previous question about the dam failure, dam breach. I had touched on the engineering and design process that we go through, but in addition to that design process, we have a very robust and intensive construction monitoring, construction oversight regime that we implement for these kinds of projects, where we're out there side by side with the construction contractors looking over their shoulders to make sure that they're actually putting in the ground the features and the way it was actually designed, to ensure that they adhere to not only the design standards, but actually the construction standards that we have for these types of projects. Back to you, Jen.
Thanks, John. So Liz, I don't see any other open questions in the Q&A right now.
Okay, great. All right, we'll move on to the raised hand feature. So right now I see we have 2 hands raised. We'll start off with Newton Cook. Do you want to unmute yourself? It looks like you're muted now. To unmute, it's *6, and you can state your comment or question. It looks like
Now,
you're muted.
Can you?
Oh, now.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can.
Okay, I'm not on the *6 I'm on the Zoom. Okay. This is like deja vu all over again, and I'm going to say thank you guys. I don't think I have to tell any of you. I've been screaming for work north of the lake for things I'm hearing today. We all know when the EAA reservoir is going to be done, 2033. 30 years. Please don't let this go 30 years. We've got to get something north of the lake to slow that water down and to prevent the high lake, that particularly loathsome plans, which is going to kill what little SAV is left. And I noted the stumbling answer, and the lady probably has what she has to work with. We have less than 5,000 acres of SAV on a 500,000 acre lake. There should be 100,000 acres of SAV on that lake. And until there is, it will not be a healthy lake. And the water that you send to the St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee and south to the Everglades will be dirty. It's not a complicated program here. But I just want to say positive things about what we're doing here. It is so important to get this water slowed down coming into Lake Okeechobee. Next, when I was discussing EAA Reservoir in 2003, there seemed to be a problem. There was no public access, no boat ramps in the plans. I do note that this presentation today mentioned maybe recreation. That can't be maybe. The law says you have to put a certain percentage of these projects into public access and recreation. So certainly we hope there will be a boat ramp in each of the sales plan on the early plans, because once you don't get them in the early plans, it's almost impossible to get them in the later plans. These will be great recreational resources, fishing, probably some hunting, but mostly fishing. Thank you again for what you're doing. Great project. I just wish I'd be here to see it, but at my age, I won't. But it's a start. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. All right, next up is Miss Nyla Pipes. Nyla, you muted yourself. Now you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Sound check.
We can hear you.
Fantastic. Nyla Pipes, One Florida Foundation. I want to first and foremost echo Newton's comments about access and recreation. And one of the things that I scribbled down in my notes when I was looking at the slides being presented is I see may include boat ramps, natural areas, and equestrian opportunities. But I also think this might be a great fit for duck hunting and gator hunting. So I think that's something we should definitely consider. Remember, the more users you have, the more support you build behind these big projects. Storage north of Lake O is really where I started advocating over a decade ago now. And I've got to tell you, it doesn't surprise me in the least to see the major improvements to both the lake and the downstream conditions in the estuaries. I think it's incredibly important that we move forward on this as quickly as possible. And I want you to know that I am here to help however I can to advocate for LOCAR. There are a couple of things I keep hearing on the landscape as far as, you know, when I'm out and about and talking to people about this project. One is flooding concerns, and I know you've addressed that a couple of times here in the Q&A. The other I'm hearing is concern for the fur-bearing animals and how this interacts with the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So I'm just bringing that to you because I think that these are questions we need to answer as we move forward. And, you know, ultimately, just like LOSM, we know that there's a give and take whenever we do any of these major projects. But I do believe that this has such benefit for the majority of both people and our ecosystems that we should definitely move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pipes. All right, we'll move on to the next person with their hand raised, Mr. Scott Martin.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you for having me on. You know, I share, my wife and I are sitting here today. We share the same concerns and excitement that Newton and Nyla share as well. So I do want to give a big round of applause for South Florida Water Management and the district for implementing some of these projects north of the lake. We've been screaming for many, many years to slow the flow into the lake. That's been our motto. We see the damaging floodwaters that come into this lake every single year, flood out the lake and drown out all of our SAV. We used to have 100,000 acres of SAV in this lake. We had shrimp grass, eelgrass, hydrilla, all around the lake that filtered the water for free every single day. As this wind blew, it pushed water all around the lake, through the marsh, in and out of the marsh, and it filtered the water. And we didn't have the problems that we have now on the coast. And now, with the years and years of flooding this lake out and keeping the water high, the grass has receded down to an alarming amount. And I think Newton said the word 5,000 acres, but believe it or not, Newton, it's at 1,500 acres right now, which is basically zero. We have zero SAV in Lake Okeechobee. So our main concern, obviously, is bringing back the habitat in Lake Okeechobee, bringing back the filtering of the Lake Okeechobee's water within the lake that this lake can provide. And so we're excited about these projects north of the lake, the ASR wells, the project that we're talking about here today, and all these things that will benefit reducing some of the water levels in the lake and allowing this grass to grow. So thank you so much for doing this. We're in full support of it, because 95% of the water that enters into the lake enters through the Kissimmee River Valley. And that's where we get a lot of high nutrients coming down, and we need to slow that down, of course. You know, and again, talking about SAV, and the reason I brought that question up is because I want that to be a part. I want that to be a part of every study going forward in every project that we do here in South Florida, because We have 500,000 acres of a lake out there that has 1,500 acres of SAV. That is sad. And we need to all get real and understand that we need to fight to get 100,000 acres of vegetation, submerged vegetation back in this lake. So again, the ducks can return, the fishing and the habitat can return, the tourism can return. We have very, very low reproductive rates right now on our fish. The FWC are doing studies. We're not getting spawns right now. We've got major issues. And when you look at this project here, LOCAR being many years down the road of finishing these projects. And when you look at all the projects on the board, we're talking 20, 30 years from now. We cannot wait for that. We have to focus on Lake Okeechobee. We have to focus on the vegetation in the lake and managing the proper water levels. And we need funding for this. So as much as we're in support of these projects north of the lake, which again, big round of applause for that, we have to start looking at how do we increase the vegetation in this lake. It is something that is vital to the entire system, and it will make a major impact, not only again to the water going that does have to go east and west occasionally, but of course it'll help the water going south, but most importantly, to help the habitat, the wildlife, the manatees that call this place home, the bass, and all the millions of people that love to come here in our region to enjoy Lake Okeechobee. We don't have beaches. We don't have golf courses. We don't have malls. We have Lake Okeechobee, this beautiful resource here in my backyard, and we have to protect it. So again, I'm just here standing up for the lake. I'm here to help get more habitat in the lake, and anything that we can do, anything that South Florida Water Management can do, any more projects that we can do that can help increase that acreage in Lake Okeechobee, increase the filter in Lake Okeechobee is what we're here to help. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for your comment, Mr. Martin. We'll move on to Mr. Paul Gray.
Yeah, thank you. Paul Gray from Audubon. I just want to thank you guys for pursuing this component A. When they did the restudy and they looked north of the lake and thought about what they needed to do, this was the very largest project that they envisioned. And it's been hard to formulate. We've tried twice and haven't quite got there. So I'm really glad you guys are sticking with it and trying to get it there. It's not going to fix everything. In hindsight, they didn't realize back then how much work we needed to do north of the lake to really get it back to where we want it. But this will be a huge step if we can get this thing formulated. So I really thank you guys for pursuing it again and again. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. All right. Looks like we have one more hand raised. Miss Kelly Ralston, go ahead and state your comment or question.
Good afternoon. I'm Kelly Ralston. I'm with the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, and I've been engaged in this process probably since almost 10 years ago, probably about the same time Nyla has, and I really appreciate the comments that have come before me, as well as the efforts of the Water Management District to continue to move forward in looking at storage on the north side of the lake. We are supportive of a reservoir of this capacity, recognizing how much storage we need all around Lake Okeechobee and how critical it is not only for the health of the lake, but also for the health of the whole ecosystem. So from our perspective, it's not only about management, but the system-wide recovery in the system. And I think this is a key component. So kudos to the Water Management District for moving forward there.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Ralston. We have one more hand raised. It's Mr. Mike Elfenbein. Go ahead and please state your comment.
Hey there, Mike Elfenbein. I also wanted to throw my support to this project and the effort to store water north of Lake Okeechobee, reemphasize the need to do it sooner than later, and capitalize on Nyla's comments previously about ensuring there's inclusion of fishing and hunting opportunities amongst those recreational opportunities. Otherwise, appreciate the hard work of the district, knowing how many different projects you all are working on simultaneously, and look forward to seeing some benefits to this for Lake Okeechobee and that submerged aquatic vegetation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comment. At this time, I don't see any more hands raised, and I don't see anything else in the Q&A. So at this time, we'll go ahead and adjourn today's meeting. Like I had mentioned, the presentation will be posted on our webpage, which is shown on this slide at the top left corner. And the video will be posted, the recording of the meeting will be posted on our YouTube channel.